I am most pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Nathan Walter. Dr. Walter is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. He is founder and director of the Center for Media Psychology and Social Influence and a faculty member at the Center for Communication and Health, both at Northwestern. Dr. Walter's research concerns the evaluation of health messages, correction of misinformation, and the role of emotion and affect in social influence. His studies have been published in a number of leading journals like the Journal of Communication, Communication Research, Human Communication Research, and Communication Monographs, which I would say are like the top 4 journals in communication. His most recent work, which is supported by the FDA, the Delaney Family Foundation, and the Pearson Foundation, focus on novel methods to debunk misinformation and reduce health-related disparity. I should also maybe informally add that I think that Dr. Nathan Walter is a rising star in the field of health risk communication and persuasion in general. So I've been following his work, and so really delighted to have him today. Now, Dr. Walter's talk today is entitled "Making It Real: The Role of Parasocial Relationships in Enhancing Perceived Susceptibility about perceived susceptibility and COVID-19 protective behavior." And sounds really interesting and timely, okay? Dr. Walter will speak for about, I would say for about 35 to 40 minutes. And then I asked the audience members to mute their mics at all time during the talk. And following the talk, we'll have a Q&A session. So when we do the Q&A, feel free to raise your digital hand and I'll call on you. And if you want to ask Dr. Walter a question directly, and you can also leave your questions in the chat room, and I should be able to read out the questions for you. So you have 2 options to do that. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Nathan Walter.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Excellent, excellent. So let me just share my screen. Okay.
Yep.
Yes, excellent. Yeah. So thank you so much, Shuli, for this invitation and the awesome opportunity. Thank you all for joining this conversation on a Friday. Let me start by acknowledging my amazing collaborators on this project: Robin Nabi, Jonathan Cohen, Camille Saucier, and Rebecca Tokaczynski-Forster. And also I want to thank my PhD students in the lab who make this, as well as other projects, possible. To give you some context, I want us to go back to a simpler time. Before we were arguing about COVID-19 vaccines, even before we were arguing about masks, a time where we simply tried to prove that COVID-19 is real and should be taken seriously. So during that time, the Surgeon General went on Good Morning America. It's a very popular TV show with a wide viewership, very diverse viewership, and he was asked what I consider to be the $1 billion question of health and risk communication. He was asked, how do you change people's behavior? How do you make them realize that the threat is real and they should adjust their behavior accordingly? And the Surgeon General had a very interesting answer. He said, what I really think we need to do is get our social media influencers, Kevin Durant, Donovan Mitchell, we need to get Kylie Jenner, we need to get our social media influencers out there and helping folks understand that, look, this is serious, this is absolutely serious. People are dying. And my gut reaction was, is he losing his mind? Kylie Jenner is not a medical expert. KD, Donovan Mitchell, these are excellent basketball players, but they're not epidemiologists. They don't have any background in immunology. Why would they be the messengers for this information? But then the more I thought about it, the more the Surgeon General's points seemed to make some sense. We simply don't trust our political leaders. This is a poll taken 2 weeks ago. Nearly 50% of the public have not too much confidence or no confidence at all in Biden's ability to handle the outbreak. The situation was even worse under Trump. Nearly 60% lacked confidence. So maybe politicians is not the way to go. How about medical experts, the leaders of the medical community, the most prominent of which is by far Dr. Anthony Fauci? Again, very low levels of support. So maybe there's something to that argument that celebrities, particularly those who experience COVID-19, are well positioned to make that message. I like this point made by the singer Pink after both she and her 3-year-old were diagnosed with COVID-19. She says, this illness is serious and real. People need to know that the illness affects the young and old, healthy and unhealthy, rich and the poor. Now, this idea that celebrities have power to increase awareness is not new, and probably one of the best examples goes all the way back to the Second World War, when the US, as part of its attempt to sustain the war effort, started selling war bonds. Basically, people finance the war and later they can get an interest on their investment. Who are the most obvious people to sell those war bonds? Well, probably generals, again, politicians, maybe soldiers. But no, Kate Smith, a popular radio personality of the time, she had a top 10 smash hit with God Bless America. She outraised all the generals combined in selling war bonds. She didn't have any experience in military-related issues. And the question is, why was she so successful? And when researchers came to answer, they introduced the concept of parasocial interaction or parasocial relationship, and basically making the claim that through repeated exposure to her radio shows, people developed a sense of intimacy with her. People felt like she's their friend. So when they were giving the money, they weren't giving money to a general, a politician, or even soldiers in Europe, but they were giving money to a friend in need. So this is an imaginary conversational give and take called parasocial relationship. Now, the first few years of research into parasocial relationship made some kind of shaky assumptions. The assumption was that it helps people cope with loneliness, so lonely people turn to media persona to deal with loneliness. And also, it is a psychological disorder. Actually, probably the most popular paper on parasocial relationship was published in the Journal of Psychiatry. So it just tells you something about how parasocial relationship was perceived. But now we know that we all develop parasocial relationship with celebrities and with media persona all the time. Actually, there's a lot of similarity between social and parasocial relationship. For instance, how do we react when a favorite character is taken off the air? We react in a way that is somewhat similar to how we react when a real relationship in our life is dissolving for some reason. We go through very similar steps. An even more extreme version is parasocial grief. What happens when a celebrity that we like dies? We go for something that is akin to real grief. So before even thinking about COVID-19, we wanted to ask the question, well, what can the literature on parasocial relationship tell us? It's growing in popularity. There's new studies every year. but the findings are not well aligned. Some studies suggest that parasocial relationship is a substitution for social relationships. So namely, people that struggle to establish and maintain relationship in real life turn to media persona to satisfy this need. Other studies argue the opposite. Parasocial relationship is an extension of social relationship. So quote unquote, people that are friendly in real life and find it easy to establish relationship, find it also easier to establish relationship with mediated persona or mediated figures. So given this discrepancy, we just wanted to understand what's the lay of the land. And particularly, we were interested in two big questions. The first was how and why parasocial relationships develop. And one approach, as I mentioned, is the substitution hypothesis. Parasocial relationships are there to substitute real life relationship. So we can assume that individual characteristics that are indicative of poor social life, such as loneliness, shyness, anxious attachment styles, and low self-esteem, will be positively associated with parasocial relationship. The contrasting approach is this extension of one social circle. And the most prominent hypothesis in this area is called the Pansep-Jacobson hypothesis. And it comes from neuroscience. And here the idea is that our social world is constantly changing. The technology changes, how we interact with people, that changes, but we navigate this world with our kind of very old vessel, our brain and neural system that is not evolving as quickly. So although we are able to distinguish real life relationships from parasocial relationship and real life interactions from media representations of those interactions, we use the same neural infrastructure to process both. So we are likely to see a lot of similarities between social and parasocial relationship. So those individuals who seek social bonds in real life will also be those who seek them parasocially. So here the hypothesis could be that homophily, birds of the feather flock together, will predict parasocial relationship. Perceived physical and social attractiveness of the media figure will also predict parasocial relationships. So again, the same mechanisms that are responsible for social relationship will also predict parasocial relationship. From the literature, mainly in interpersonal communication, we know that women develop more meaningful relationship than men. So the question was whether they also develop more intense parasocial relationship than men. Is there a difference between same-sex and cross-sex parasocial relationship? So for instance, when women develop relationship with men characters and vice versa. Is parasocial relationship intensity associated with the amount of exposure? Again, the idea that just like in real life, we're more likely to develop relationship with people that we see all the time. Can we replicate the same dynamic in a parasocial context? And is the intensity of parasocial relationship depends on the type of the character? Is it fictional or non-fictional? And the second big question had to do with the effects, because again, we were interested in the effects of celebrities on COVID-related behaviors. So we just wanted to understand whether parasocial relationship influences persuasive outcomes, including message-consistent attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. Now, for the first study, the methodology was a meta-analysis, and I'll maybe just say 2 words about a meta-analysis, because it's just a less common method. The idea is that there's no such thing as a perfect study. And each study suffers from some limitations, from some bias, from some error. Ideally, this error is arbitrary. So sometimes it leads us to overestimate effects. In other cases, it leads us to underestimate effect. If we synthesize the entire literature and pull all the findings together, we are more likely to get at the true effect of parasocial relationship. So for the sake of the synthesis, we search for relevant electronic databases using the keyword parasocial. When we found relevant studies, we searched for the reference lists. And then we went to conference papers because these studies are often not indexed in electronic databases. And finally, we reached out to 18 leading scholars in this field of parasocial relationship to see if we forgot something, if they have unpublished data. Our inclusion criteria were, each study had to include a measurement of parasocial relationship. They had to include either measurements of predictors of outcomes or parasocial relationship. We focused only on studies on individuals at age 13-year-olds and above because there's literature that suggests that relationship develop very differently below that age. And studies had to report on zero-order correlations between the different constructs. So using these inclusion and exclusion criteria, this is how we got from nearly 300 studies to 120 studies from 116 research reports. So the results, in line with the substitution hypothesis, we did find that there's a somewhat weak association between parasocial relationship and anxious attachment styles, but there was absolutely no support for loneliness as a predictor of PSR, shyness, or low self-esteem. So very weak support for the substitution hypothesis in general. Regarding the view of parasocial relationship as an extension rather than a substitution of social relationship, we did find that perceived homophily with the media persona strongly predicts parasocial relationship. Also, physical attractiveness and social attractiveness, basically the same dynamics that predict social relationships. As expected, women reported more intense parasocial relationship than men, but there was no significant difference between same-sex and cross-sex parasocial relationships. Parasocial relationship was moderately associated with the amount of exposure to the media figure. And again, that makes sense. Just like with real life, we feel like we know better those that we're exposed to more because we're able to predict how they will behave in certain situations. No significant differences between the intensity when it comes to fictional and non-fictional characters, which again, I think speaks to the power and beauty of this concept. And most encouraging, quite substantial associations between PSR levels and persona-related attitudes, behavior intent, and behavior. So that sets up nicely this possibility that a parasocial relationship can play a role in COVID-19 related behavior. Not substantial support that it's somehow related to social deficiencies other than anxious attachment styles, but substantial support that it mirrors non-mediated relationships. It's associated with the need to satisfy social needs, facilitate interpersonal relationships, and more intense in social groups that are predisposed to form stronger interpersonal bonds. So going back to COVID-19, the question is, what can parasocial relationship with celebrities do in the saturated media environment? The notion that parasocial relationship can influence health-related decision-making is well established, especially when celebrities disclose a disease, a health condition. We see that it increases people's awareness about that disease or condition. Probably the most famous example is press conference by the basketball player Earvin Magic Johnson when he disclosed his HIV status. So we're talking about the early 90s, so much misconception, so much stigma around HIV. And the press conference takes place on November 7th. And you can see the spike in calls to the National AIDS Hotline, to the point where most of those calls went unanswered. There were just not enough staff. Now, this study is so interesting because they also showed that it's not mere familiarity with Magic Johnson, but it's this deeper relationship, parasocial relationship that people had with the basketball player. More recently, Angelina Jolie writes an op-ed in the New York Times, walking readers through her decision-making associated with preventative mastectomy. And we see again these spikes in people going to the CDC website to read about BRCA1, BRCA2, cancer risk, preventative mastectomy. And the differences between what happens, let's say, just in Breast Cancer Awareness Month versus after the op-ed was published are quite uncanny, as you can see here. So we were interested to see whether the same dynamics will appear in the context of COVID-19, specifically when celebrities disclose that they were infected with COVID-19. Now, this is not a mere replication. We think that it's different because unlike the case of Magic Johnson, Angelina Jolie, or other studies where the media attention was directed toward that particular celebrity, here, celebrity illness is like a drop within the sea of coverage. So this is a much more challenging context to examine the power of parasocial relationships. Also, the risk, unlike in previous studies, is more abstract, at least in the first few weeks of the pandemic, and it was differential. So we were told, oh, young people are less likely to get it, less likely to suffer from it. It mainly affects maybe those who smoke, mainly affects those with preconditions. So that's a big difference because not everyone will benefit equally from parasocial relationship. And the next question is, maybe it will actually backfire because we can see how those celebrities will be viewed as victims. They fell to the disease, but now they have to quarantine in their Hollywood mansions, which is quite different from our experience. So it can also backfire if it's viewed as privilege. The broader framework that we used is the social amplification of risk framework. And in a nutshell, it basically suggests that we're really bad at assessing risk. Sometimes we exaggerate the risk, sometimes we downplay the risk. And it's mainly because the way that we get information about the risk. So our argument is, if parasocial relationship can mirror social relationships, then being aware that a relevant media figure is diagnosed with COVID-19 should generate a response akin to learning that a friend or an acquaintance is sick. And if that's the case, maybe it will increase people's awareness. So the prediction was that parasocial relationship with a diagnosed celebrity will increase behavior intent to take protective measures against COVID-19. And perhaps this relationship will be mediated through perceived susceptibility to the virus. But not everyone are likely to benefit from parasocial relationship, because if you're older, you don't need these parasocial relationships to tell you that you're at risk. So maybe the ones that will benefit will be younger people. Also, if you're already aware of the disease and you follow the news, parasocial relationship shouldn't affect you too much. It should mainly affect those that don't engage in active information seeking about COVID-19. And finally, if you have people in your life sick with COVID-19, again, we shouldn't see the same types of effects. So it's mainly for those that didn't have real life contact with COVID-19, which at the time where we collected the data, as you will see, were the vast majority of the population. So the data was collected in April 2020, about 15 days after most of the states went into lockdown. We recruited 500 participants and used a quota sample, trying to approximate the distributions in the US population. Early on, it seemed as if political affiliation is the #1 predictor of risk perception, so it was really important for us to control for this. And the measures that we used, perceived susceptibility, a 3-item measure. Here you can see some of the sample items, a 10-item behavior intent measure, parasocial relationship validated measure. I'll say a few words about how we measured parasocial relationship in the study on the next slide. And also, of course, our moderators, age, active information seeking, and real-life contact with COVID. So a lot of pre-testing went into coming up with this list. We started with a list of about 25 celebrities, and we were limited to the celebrities that actually were disclosed their COVID-19 diagnosis early on. So we wanted to find those that people actually knew and felt some affinity with. And this is how we narrowed our 25 list to these 10 people. So people first had to choose one celebrity from that list and then answer the parasocial relationship questions pertaining to that one particular celebrity. We were concerned that it's not parasocial relationship with a diagnosed celebrity per se, but maybe it's just people that are more empathetic, are likely to develop parasocial relationship. So we also created a list of similar celebrities, similar in vocation and their following on social media, that were not diagnosed with COVID-19 as far as we know. And participants, again, had to choose one and answer the parasocial relationship scale for that one celebrity. So we can control for parasocial relationship with an undiagnosed celebrity. So controlling for parasocial relationship with undiagnosed celebrity, active information seeking, being around the person with COVID-19, knowing someone who had COVID-19, political ideology, income, age, education, and gender, we did find that PSR enhances perceived susceptibility, and in turn, that enhances behavior intent to take protective measures. More importantly, the effect was mediated as we predicted. But I think that for me, at least personally, the really interesting thing is to try and find these boundary conditions. So as you can see here, the x-axis represents different levels of PSR intensity, and the lines represent different age groups. At very low levels of PSR, there's a substantial difference where older participants felt that they're more likely to engage in protective behaviors, but at high level of PSR, these differences go away, which is wonderful. It's like parasocial relationships are able to compensate and make the risk feel more real. Similar dynamic for information seeking. Again, at high level of PSR, differences in information seeking seem to go away, have these, was like a mainstreaming effect here. And same thing when it comes to direct contact. At high level of PSR, the differences between those that had direct contact and those that did not with COVID-19, again, seem to go away. So it seems that parasocial relationship can encourage protective behaviors, especially for those for whom otherwise it will seem abstract or vague. In terms of why it happens or the explanations, there's many things that we can say. These are somewhat related, like the meta-analysis findings suggest. parasocial relationship can feel as if you're extending your social circle. So maybe it's somewhat similar to having a friend or an acquaintance sick. So it makes the risk feel closer. Also, convergence of risk. It makes the risk feel closer, and it just highlights the fact that it can also happen to younger people. It can also happen to people that I think are healthier. And finally, and I'll spend some time talking about the optimism bias when I talk about the next study, can reduce our optimism bias. Optimism bias is one of the most robust biases that we see in risk communication and health communication. This idea that we downplay our own risk. And if you see someone that you feel some affinity to experience the thing, perhaps it helps you to realize that you're susceptible as well. So it's not a perfect study. It has many limitations. Like most of literature on risk communication, it's opportunistic, which means that we're limited to the celebrities that were actually sick, and we're limited in terms of time, and we're limited in terms of the real world developments, which reduces our ability to control all these aspects. Also, it's correlational. So one can also make the argument that it's not parasocial relationship that does all these things, but rather maybe when they disclose their diagnosis, you maybe feel closer to them. I'm not entirely sure that I'm convinced by this argument, but it's correlational data with everything that comes with it. And finally, we are not able to answer the how question because it's correlational data, because we're not looking at the causal mechanism. The reason we're not looking at the causal mechanism is it's very difficult to manipulate parasocial relationship. So as far as I know, there are only 1 or 2 studies, experimental studies on parasocial relationship. And even those studies were field experiments, because it's, again, difficult to tell people, oh, you develop a relationship with her. But still, we try to address these limitations in our next study that zeroed in on the underlying mechanism. We're trying to think why this happens. It's a poll during the early stages of the pandemic, people being twice as likely to think that the coronavirus will greatly harm the health of people in the US in general, compared to our own community or our own family. The vast majority of people think that the coronavirus is not going to harm them. And the question is why it happens, and more importantly, how can we prove to people that it can happen to them? Because if you have this very rosy view of the world, you're unlikely to take it seriously, as we see with a lot of people at the moment. As I mentioned, the optimism bias is quite robust, quite consistent, difficult to get rid of. We all underestimate the likelihood of bad things happening to us. What's the odds of you fatally sleeping during the shower? And we overestimate the likelihood of good things happening to us. So how do we get people to, at least momentarily, remove these rose-colored glasses and adjust their susceptibility level? The interesting thing about the optimism bias is that it has a strong social component. It's a self-serving bias. So when people are asked to compare the likelihood of bad things happening to them compared to their close friends, there's a weak optimism bias. And it grows the further the reference is from us. So the larger optimism bias, the stronger optimism bias is retrieved when people are asked to compare their risk to the risk of others, as opposed to close friends. So our hypothesis here was, well, maybe that's the same thing that happens with parasocial relationship. Because if I have parasocial relationship with Kevin Durant and it's weak, there should be strong optimism bias. However, if the parasocial relationship intensity grows, then the optimism bias should be weaker. In this study, we try to manipulate parasocial relationship. We try to prime people with parasocial relationship to show or to see if it will attenuate the optimism bias, which in turn should have negatively association with perceived susceptibility, which would mean that eventually reducing the optimism bias results in a more positive or higher susceptibility level. So this study took place almost 1 year to the day after the second study that I shared with you. In terms of the procedure, we asked people to list 3 to 5 names of well-known celebrities. We gave some criteria, people that they follow, people that they care about. And then for about 15 minutes, people engage in distractor tasks. So all conditions, we only had 2 engage in distractor tasks, all conditions wrote the names of the celebrities. Distractor tasks were trivia questions and identifying headlines. We're basically trying to make them not think about the names that they just listed. Then we shared accurate information about the new variant from the CDC website, and it was kind of before the Delta variant, so it was the first wave of new variants. And then we exposed all participants to 7 celebrities that were ostensibly diagnosed with the new variant. That's the deception. Now, the only difference between the control and the experiment is in the experimental group, we used one of the celebrities that these people mentioned in the first stage. So one of the celebrities that they themselves chose reappeared in the list. That didn't happen in the control condition. Then we measured PSR, then we measured optimism bias, perceived susceptibility, and debriefed everyone about the deception. We wanted to validate that this manipulation actually worked, and we tried to validate it in 2 ways. First, when the name of the celebrity was piped, so in the experimental group, 80% chose the celebrity that they themselves wrote, as opposed to one that was given by us. So that would mean that that's good news for us. And also, compared to the control condition, people in the primed PSR condition had a higher level of parasocial relationship when we actually measured it. So again, that's good news. We use same measures as before, and the optimism bias, which is calculated as the difference between people saying that how likely is it that you will get sick with one of the new variants of COVID-19 in the near future, versus how likely is it that another person of the same age and sex who lives in X, and we used again piped text, will get sick with one of the new variants of COVID-19 in the near future. And the fact that the measure is on average positive means that on average people think that they have less likelihood of getting sick, as one would expect. So what did we find? We didn't find a significant main effect of the primed PSR on perceived susceptibility, but we did find that it reduced the optimism bias. Again, those that responded to a celebrity that they themselves chose, presumably those that had higher PSR, were also reported on a lower level of optimism bias, and optimism bias had a negative effect on perceived susceptibility, which is excellent. And there was also an indirect significant effect. So to conclude, we see that in this study, those that were made aware that a celebrity that they had a meaningful relationship with, contracted a new variant of COVID-19, they themselves felt less optimistic about their chances of avoiding the same fate compared to those who chose a celebrity from a predefined list of celebrity. In turn, weaker optimism bias leads people to take their own risk of contracting the new variants more seriously, which is excellent. And this is especially encouraging since the ability to mitigate the optimism bias is extremely challenging. It's one of those highly robust, difficult to move biases just because it has this self-serving element in it. General conclusions, maybe we can discuss some of those. Just talks about the power of these mid-level gatekeepers that might be critical for future public health crises, given the eroding trust in public institutions. We're constantly trying to get the toothpaste back into the tube, but maybe we should just acknowledge that this is how it's going to look from now on, and we should rely more on those that are not necessarily experts, but have this unique position. Future directions, replicate, expand, and also focus on more controversial contexts. We wanted to see whether there would be celebrities who would have a negative message. I contracted the virus and it's not a big deal. And we found a few, but they were not as pronounced as the positive ones. So we decided not to run that study. Thank you so much. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Fantastic. Wow, this is really great. So like I said earlier, you guys can put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I can call up on you. I see a lot of applause. Are there questions? Nathan, this is so funny because I didn't know you were going to talk about, well, I mean, parasocial relationship certainly has been studied with celebrity a lot, but it just didn't occur to me that you were actually looking at celebrity, because I'm teaching a undergrad class on research methods this semester. Our class project is to design an experiment to test the impact of celebrity like statement about COVID vaccination on public's intention to get vaccinated. So so this reminded me that maybe we should put parasocial measures in our questionnaire, like as a way of with the more parasocial relationships you have with the celebrity, would that increase the impact of their either support, you know, we're gonna look at two kinds of celebrity messages, like one's pro-vaccine and the other's more vaccine hesitant kind of messages. When we look at the impact, would parasocial relationships serve as a kind of moderator in those relationships? So just reminding me how interesting this could be to have that variable in the questionnaire. So I saw we have a hand, Jingbo Man, right? So yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first I want to thank Nathan for this great presentation. That's very interesting study. And also, yeah, and also I'll thank Dr. Nan for organizing this virtual seminar. It's very good. So people from anywhere can listen to this. This is, you know, really nice. Yeah. So for Nathan, I was surprised that about this parasocial interaction. So all of my research has been about the real, you know, relationships, like our relationships with families, friends who we actually know in the real life. So some research has found that the media reports about COVID cases or risks about COVID has a, you know, weaker relationship or weaker effect on people's perception about the risk. But if people start to know, you know, someone in their neighborhood or someone in their workplace has contracted, you know, like the COVID, then they start to increase the risk perception. My question is, have you ever thought to compare this parasocial influence, relationship influence versus, the real life relationship influence on people's perception about risks? Because I see, if we see, like media reports as one end and the true relationship as the other end, this parasocial relationship seems to be somewhere kind of in between. Yeah.
Jingbo, this is such a good point. We actually got a grant now to study, we call it the communication ecology, this idea that everything is kind of interrelated. And just like you said, we're looking not only at the effects of relationship with media persona or with media characters and their position on vaccination, but also the position within people's ego social networks. And more importantly, how these interact, because the argument kind of going all the way back to cultivation research and resonance is, if both your social environment and your media diet say the same thing or show the same reality, you should get this bigger effect. So definitely, this is such a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I see another hand, Yan Huang.
Yes. So first I want to thank Nathan for your wonderful presentation. It's interesting and fascinating to see how you developed a series of projects on parasocial interaction. And also thanks Dr. Nan for organizing this wonderful event. A really great opportunity for us to exchange the most recent research. And I have a question for Nathan, is about identification and parasocial interaction, because sometimes they were discussed in different contexts, but sometimes, like especially for narrative persuasion, which is my area of research, and a lot of times they are proposed as two different processes about how people engage and involve with the story character. So I'm curious, have you thought about the differences between the two? Or like, is there a magic switch? Suddenly people decided to identify themselves with the character, but in a different situation, maybe people feel like they are more likely to be friends with the story character. Or is this, are these two processes that can co-occur at the same time? So I'm just curious about your take on this.
Yeah, and I love this. We're gonna split some hairs right now. This is such an interesting question. I'm going to say something and then I'm going to contradict myself. They should be different. Parasocial relationship is you are you and they are they. And identification is the merging of these entities. You're one with someone. So theoretically speaking, they should be different. They shouldn't be a high correlation between identification and parasocial relationship. The problem with this kind of neat theory is that in our meta-analysis, we saw a strong correlation between parasocial relationship and identification. My guess is that you're absolutely right. I don't know if there's a magic switch, but I think that from, in the process of exposure to, like you said, that you're studying narrative persuasion, we travel from maybe seeing them more like strangers, then seeing them as friends, then identifying with their goals, and then sharing their perspective. So it's really messy. And I think we need better theories and better empirical research. Yeah, but thank you. That's such a great point.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think we have another hand, Jian Li.
Hello. Yeah, Nathan, thank you so much for sharing your excellent research, and thank you, Shaoli, for doing this. My question is about, what really makes people feel about the parasocial relationship. So in your recent publication, it seems that you are interested in measuring the effects of parasocial relationship. But recently, we have seen so many kind of cases that virtual avatar has been emerged, and then some communication professionals create a social media account for a virtual avatar and then, let them doing so. So you mentioned a little bit about the fictional, the celebrity. So I wanted to hear more about your thoughts about what really can make people to have a parasocial relationship. And in order to expand and apply our parasocial relationship to a more fictional avatar spaces, what could be the most, interesting and important factor that make people to feel about the parasocial relationship?
Oh, Gian, this is really interesting. Actually, a lot of the research, the early stuff in parasocial relationship focused on how to facilitate parasocial relationship. So for instance, if you think about late night talk shows and the way that the furniture there, it looks like a living room. So you're with friends, they stare directly at you as the audience. They don't talk with the audience in the room, they talk to you. Some shows have kind of recurring themes. It's like almost like an inside joke that you would have with your friends. So there's a lot of tiny things, a lot of close-ups. You feel closer to someone, letting people into your thought psyche, right? Sharing something like we've seen with House of Cards, when you break the fourth wall. So all these things contribute now with avatars, and I think that we need to study this area more. As long as they resemble, for instance, social media influencers and behave like social media influencers, I don't see why not. The only problem with most of what I've seen is that these entities are unpredictable. And the beautiful thing about parasocial relationship, and the beautiful thing, like Jingbo said, about social relationship, is our ability to predict. So I feel closer to you, Gian, when I know you. And I know you when I'm able to predict how you're going to behave in certain situations. And these avatars are such loose cannons sometimes that I'm not sure. That's the one barrier that I see, but it's a really interesting future direction.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Just a reminder, Ji Yang is our next speaker, scheduled to talk in December. So please come back for her wonderful talk. We can probably take one more question. If you guys have any questions, please raise your hand. Well, if I'm not seeing any hand, I do have a minor, perhaps, observation for Nathan. Like, in terms of parasocial relationship, do you think people are in general having this relationship with the actor or the characters they're playing? Like, for instance, there is an actor who's played a superhero and also a villain, like in a different movie. Like, it doesn't matter how the audience members see that actor as either as a hero or a villain, doesn't matter. That the characters they play in this parasocial relationship, to what extent that matters to the audience members and their response to the celebrity endorsement or whatever.
There's some really interesting research done by Norita Lohr, and more recent stuff by Riva Tokaczynski on that precise question. And I think that what they find is it kind of leaks. So even if you realize that this is just a character that they play, and I think that in Norita Lohr's study, it was like an abusive husband and then a very positive character, and people were exposed to different variations of this, it leaks to how people perceive the person, the actor. So this is really interesting. And again, it just goes to strengthen this hypothesis that we're good at differentiating reality from fiction, not really good at processing it differently.
Yeah, Yeah, I was just wondering, does it matter if a Superman gets sick or like a, you know, like a hijacker gets sick, you know, in the news. So I think we're at 1 o'clock, so we should probably wrap this up. And again, thank you so much, Nathan, for coming and talk to us in this virtual world. And this has been really fantastic. Very impressive 3 studies presentation covering like from meta-analysis to survey to experiment at the end. So this is really fantastic. And so we will have the recording on our site for anyone who couldn't come here today. Again, thanks to the speaker and as well as the audience member who kept quiet during the talk. So I'll hopefully see you guys next time for Ji Young's talk in December.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.